Johnny Ryan, thank you very much indeed for your time, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our conversation within Digital Markets Research Hub. You were known as a kind of a person who specializes in data protection and online advertising, and you understand the mechanics of the process, and you also understand the regulatory landscape. So I propose and you were there before it became somehow mainstream. So you are a veteran, even if you're a very young-looking man. So I propose we will somehow divide our conversation into several parts, and maybe we will start with just a brief reminder about the mechanism of online advertising and why data breach is at the heart of online advertising industry. Can we probably start with this?
Yeah, Soles, and thank you for inviting me. So maybe the best way to think about it is that the online advertising market has lots of different parts to it, but most ads that you'll see on the internet or on your mobile device in total in a year will be put there by something called real-time bidding. So these are the auctions for your attention, real-time bidding, and the bids are companies bidding for your attention. So I'll tell you how it works. You arrive on a web page, the editorial content appears on your screen, and there'll be at least one rectangle that is empty for a split second. In that split second, information about you is sent by the publisher, the owner of that website or even app, to a tech company. And the tech company represents, hundreds maybe of prospective bidders. Now, those bidders are other tech companies, and each of them represents one or more prospective advertisers. So you've arrived on this page to read about something highly sensitive. Maybe it's a medical condition or something you wouldn't like anyone to know about. And you're standing in the medical clinic reading about this. You're at least, most likely, your IP address, which will probably be useful for finding your location, and what you're reading will be sent out to tens, conceivably hundreds of companies. One of those recipients will win the auction and have its ad shown to you. All of that happens just in about 200 milliseconds while you're loading the page. And you'll probably have noticed, sometimes you're on a web page and you're just about to start reading and the content gets bumped down a bit because an ad pops in. So in that stutter is a breach of your data. It is being vented out to a large number of companies and there's no control over it at all.
And actually, I must note, John, that you were talking about this problem that it's kind of in the DNA of online advertising and real-time bidding in particular, or more narrowly speaking, on several occasions. And I think the impact was really eye-opening for many. But if I understand correctly, the technicality of the issue, that the third-party cookies mechanism, is it unavoidable? Is it just something which we have to acknowledge as and be just more mindful, or is there any kind of real treatment to this?
I used to work in that industry, and it seems to me that there's a very easy solution. Very, very easy. Advertising has been paying partially or totally for editorial content for centuries. It's not just 100 years, it goes way back, at least to the 1600s, if not long before that. And the historical anomaly is the last decade, a little bit over a decade. Real-time bidding is only about 10, maybe 13 years old. So although this is the most popular technology at the moment, we're not talking about fundamentally changing what the internet is when we talk about fixing this problem. How can the problem be fixed? Well, I don't think you go to one publisher, one big newspaper, and say, you must stop. Because that publisher, although they are breaking the law by behaving this way, they're competing with other publishers, and there's a first mover disadvantage in the market. The same goes for the advertiser. The same goes for the technology firms that cause this mess in the middle. So you don't go to those parties. Instead, you go to the standard setters, and there are only two. So we're talking about a problem that involves hundreds of thousands of different companies, including publishers, advertisers, big and small tech firms. But the rules for each of them are set either by Google, which is the biggest player and has its own rules, or by an industry trade body that is called the IAB. Now, I've litigation against Google and the IAB and multiple different parts of the IAB. But I don't think it should be just for us to litigate against them. In 2016, following the Snowden revelations, the GDPR was introduced, and there was a 2-year period where companies had to get their houses in order before that law would be enforced. What that law did is it created enforcers with the power to fix this problem. So in particular, the Irish Data Protection Commission should be enforcing the rules on Google so that it cleans up this mess. And the other data protection authorities, where relevant, should be enforcing this on the IAB. Now, our litigation against the IAB is in Hamburg, because that's where the international standards bit of the IAB has its European presence. And we're also leading an action against IAB Europe for the consent pop-ups, which are totally unlawful and provide a kind of a fiction of compliance that covers this mess. And that litigation is now in Luxembourg at the ECJ, Europe's highest court, but it came out of Brussels. Now, let me just say, it seems to me the easiest solution here is that instead of broadcasting out information about everybody, about our intimate secrets, what we're watching, reading, and listening to, and where we're standing, in a way where that can all be tied together, you simply don't broadcast that information. You send no personal information. That would mean that as a publisher, you are still able to show relevant advertising, but you're relying on the context of the editorial content and a little bit of information, possibly very, very, very broad information about the reader. But if there's any chance that the information being used could be used to identify that reader, then you're straying into the legal definition of personal data, and it's illegal to broadcast that in the way the industry currently does. So what I'm describing is, today, it's like the tracking industry behaves like old Detroit. It's a dirty industry. It does not have to pay for the negative externalities. It pumps its sludge into the rivers. There are many, many market reasons why this is bad for media and democracy, many. But there's a very clear data protection legal reason why it's unlawful too. If you stop the venting of the personal data, you still get advertising, and I think more profit goes to the publisher, but it's bad news for those tech firms in between, big and small, who are making money by passing data to each other under the table.
Let me just have one or maybe even two clarificatory questions. The first one is, it looks to me from the kind of purely observer perspective that this kind of the appetite or the race for collecting data is so omnipresent, and these digital footprints are so easy to marry or match and to identify, etc. That my first question would be on the enforceability and of this provision. Is it possible to or is it too late? And does the technology, how rapidly it evolves with AI, to be even more difficult or do you think that the drawing the line between legal and illegal would suffice? Obviously, it's the first step, but I'm interested in the second one as well.
Look, first, you dropped in a phrase into that sentence. That's a kind of a anything goes phrase. The phrase is AI. Let's just remove that, right? Because it may not actually mean what people think it means. Let's say it's a way, you were using it, I think, as a way of saying, is the tech too complicated to be lawful? And that is the pervasive throw your hands up in the air sense that many, many onlookers have when they think about digital and enforcement. And it's completely inappropriate. Like the financial services sector, there were many, many players, but it turns out there were just a few who really mattered. And if you kept your eyes on them, you would have a sense of what needed to be fixed. Central banks, of course, were one. This is during the collapse. But another was the credit rating agencies. And what kind of products were they approving? And what kind of things were they rating wrongly? And so trust in the system across thousands of parties ended up being put in the wrong places and the system fell over. In real-time bidding, you have thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of companies all over the globe working in that industry. It's a huge industry worth well over, I think, 100 billion a year by the last estimate I saw. But we have key players in that industry who function as gatekeepers. Yes, one is the standard setter. So the IAB and Google, they're the standard setter. And through them, you can change the rules for everyone in the industry. Now, that can then be applied by other bits of the industry. For example, I've been describing this as an auction, but I never described what the auction house is. There are some very, very big tech companies known as advertising exchanges. Google has the biggest one. It's a big part of its business. These advertising exchanges are the clearinghouses of the data broadcast. The data is going to them, it's coming from them to everyone else. So by monitoring how the big online advertising exchanges behave, you can see whether the improved standard of behavior has actually been applied. And I find often there's a tech fatalism because people aren't thinking about how the system they want to enforce actually works. But very often, you know, if you're inside the system has to work. So there's nearly always a fairly simple way of getting a handle on the system. Often it's through the tech standard, and often there will be some gatekeeper function where that standard is applied.
Let me then ask you the second related question on this. If you observe the latest trend with Google's initiative of privacy sandbox, or actually it's a kind of broader trend with other browsers doing the same and before Google, yeah. Can't we say that they are somehow, this trend, we understand, leaving aside the intentions, which I'm happy to discuss separately, would this be a kind of a second best alternative in your view, or it would be, is it the movement or the trend in the right direction?
Well, my short answer is I don't know, and my longer answer is I have no idea. I think the person at Google who has been leading that, David Temkin, is a former colleague of mine. When I worked at Brave Software, David was the chief technology officer. Now, at Brave, which is a competing web browser, David and other of my colleagues invented an advertising system that didn't leak data about people. And that sounds very positive. I don't want to say it's not. But even if you're not leaking data about people, you may find you have another problem. Let's imagine no data leaves my device. Here's my phone. And my device receives a catalog of ads every day. This is the Brave system. And it decides, based on what it knows about me, which ad to show me and when to show that ad. Similar to a spam filter for your inbox. Because it knows you so well and you've said yes to this, it'll sift out the best offers. Now that sounds so much better than what we have today. Even in that situation, when you solve the data protection problem, the big data breach problem, you may still find you have a algorithmic discrimination problem. Because if I'm the one sending the ads, I can tell every device, don't show this job ad to pale white Irish guys in their 40s. Right? You know, it's so there will always, well, often there is a snag that needs to be thought through. It's many years since I've left Brave, and I don't know what they're doing about that problem. I think in their case, they decided they wouldn't be working with political ads for quite some time until they had addressed that. Now, the first part of my answer is simply to say, if you address the data protection issue in advertising, there are probably other issues that follow if you're taking this blind approach. And when I say blind, it's that no third party knows that you're the one on a page or an app and then decides to send you an ad because of that. It's only your device that knows. In the case of what Google may actually be doing, I have no idea. I spent some time looking at their proposals early on. Maybe that goes back 2.5 years. And I found the drafting, the language they were using in their sketches of the proposals were so vague and abstract that you could have driven a Titanic of problems in between them. So I have no willingness to assume good faith. And we're talking about issues where good faith is absolutely inappropriate. We're talking about the structure that pays for media. And I don't think we're at a point where we can look at a clear thing that they've proposed and say that looks like a good idea. And they would have to do a lot of work to make things sufficiently clear that one wouldn't have to ask follow-up questions to be absolutely certain of what Google means. This has been a problem for quite some time with Google. And oops, we're sorry we weren't clear about that. What that actually meant was this other thing. We can't have that. So I'm not willing to endorse anything that they've put out yet. No, and there's no prospect of us doing so.
Okay, let me staying on with this issue. I obviously, coming from competition law and policy series, I see it also as a challenge for horizontal new entrants, because essentially, by you close the circle and make it impossible to enter, holding full control. But this feature would also signal their genuine interest in doing it effectively, so to say. So it's kind of it somehow mitigates a little bit the intention part. But staying with the regulatory side, we know that there is kind of big case in one of many actually, where DOJ and state attorney generals consider double-click acquisition by Google as one of the main kind of triggers for this cascade of problems which you have so eloquently highlighted. So speaking of regulatory models, do you think we have to, obviously we can select both, but if we talk about the one which looks retroactively trying to restore the situation to the past and remedy the digital advertising before it became so untransparent and controlled controlled by one essentially or two companies, or you would be interested more in looking at the future, a new wave of regulatory initiatives, mainly in the European Union, which envisages more proactive regulator, more forward-looking and asymmetric, maybe?
Well, that's quite a set of questions. Let me deflect one of them so I can deal with the others. On the DOJ's case, let me put it to the side for a moment, because you're getting into a more profound issue that goes beyond a particular case. With a European lens, I think, and I have thought for some time, especially when I was working for a nascent competitor to Google, and before that, when I was working for a different competitor to Google, I have believed that data protection enforcement, not just law, but enforcement, would be a huge boost to competition. Now, I better explain that because that'll sound peculiar to some students. We think about data as an input. You know, if we've got our competition lens, it's just another input. It's just another resource. And when an enforcer or even a tech firm comes along and says, we're no longer sharing this data with other market participants in a big free-for-all, which is what we've had to date, that's clearly good for data protection because you're not allowed to broadcast everyone's secrets everywhere. And that might seem like it's bad for competition. But remember, with the market as it is, it wasn't very competitive anyway. Let's just acknowledge that fact. The market was clearly not functioning the way markets are supposed to. But second, there is a trick that a big tech firm can pull here. There are two different data free-for-alls, not one. The first data free-for-all, and RTB is a perfect example, has data being passed between hundreds or thousands of companies, and it's a huge external data free-for-all. It's external because it's outside of any one company. Now, it's over here, and Google or Amazon or Facebook comes along and says, we'll take all of that. Internally, we'll stuff it under our shirts. Every advertiser in the world can come to us for service, and every publisher who wants to place those ads can also come to us, and they'll both be our clients. Now, they will claim to have solved the external data free-for-all. I use the word external. It's a security breach, a data breach. But what they will infringe is another part of data protection law, which is called purpose limitation, storage limitation, data minimization, and so on. They will be taking the data free-for-all and putting it within themselves. And internal data free-for-alls are just as illegal under data protection law. Now, when I worked for nascent competitors to the big tech giants, I was begging data protection authorities and competition authorities to look at the internal data free-for-all, because that is where the unfair advantage came to these big firms. They take data from one bit of their business that they might have got on the merits, and it was given to them for one reason, and then they use it all the way over here in some other bit of their business for some other reason, probably totally unrelated. So what I'm saying is, if you had enforcement of data protection principles in Article 5 of the GDPR, you would not have an unfair market. You would have a market where big tech is actually functionally separated, because there would not be any by default massiveness. You know, they would need a lawful basis for each thing that they do with data, with personal data. Now, I don't mean consent for every little thing. That's not what's in the GDPR, unless the data happen to be particularly sensitive about your sexual orientation or health, for example. Let me also suggest something, that in the external data free-for-all, where there are thousands upon thousands of companies, it's an ugly market. These companies are trading data that they should not be trading. It's incredibly dangerous. It's a cancer on worthy media. It's dangerous. And for those parties to turn to competition authorities, as they have in the last 18 months, and say, referee, Apple or Google or some other person who rightly you should not trust, but to say those companies are foreclosing us by withholding this precious, new oil. It's not oil. It's connected to something far more intimate than oil. It's about what we are as people. They are foreclosing our access to that input, and you must intervene. That is like a back alley surgeon holding aloft his rusty saw, having just sawn off a leg, and pointing in anger at the newly electrified and sterilized operating theater across the road and saying, how dare those people think they're better than we are? We both saw legs off. Well, that's not an argument, because standards sometimes rise, and it became a legal requirement to sterilize your equipment and to have electric lighting when you're cutting off limbs. And we no longer allow that kind of operation to happen in our back alleys. And if we did, it would be an outrage, and it's not a matter for the competition authorities. And I think you've seen good examples in France, for example, where the concurrence went to the CNIL, the Data Protection Authority, and asked them about a matter it had received, and was told, no, that's not a thing. What these guys are proposing is not something that actually has validity. So there's a narrative abroad, and it has been abroad for some time, sometimes from otherwise worthy parties. Publishers are even involved in this, legitimate publishers, worthy publishers. And the narrative is that there is a conflict, an inevitable and inherent conflict between data protection law and competition law. And that is just not true. And it's a very unsophisticated view. If we get enforcement of purpose limitation, data minimization, storage limitation, these are things in data protection law, we will have a much more vibrant market. And since I'm monologuing, Oles, and you're not stopping me, I'm going to monologue a little bit further. Even in merger analysis, it seems to me that data protection is the untapped kryptonite to the problems we now see in the market. As I understand your domain of competition, if I'm company A and I want to acquire my friend over here, company B, and we both agree, we go to you as the competition authority, Oles, and we say, we want to combine. A wants to buy B. And you ask us what we intend to do when we marry. And then you talk to our friends and our family and our enemies. And you say, what do you think is going to happen? Will they move into the house around the corner and so on? Will their kids behave? And based on hearsay and wild speculation and a bit of economic mumbo jumbo, you come up with some sort of theory and you approve it generally, and all too infrequently you say, no, I found something of substance, you shall not pass. Well, data-based companies are really, really great, because although for years you may have thought they were impenetrable and a little bit intimidating, actually there's a really nice tool for understanding what they do. Under data protection law, they have to have documents that are detailed. They probably maintain documents that are very vague, but they have to, by law, have detailed documents that describe each separate thing that they use personal data for, each separate thing. Now imagine that as a spreadsheet. Here is every single thing inside my business that I'm using data for, including, for example, if I'm providing health insurance for my employees and I'm working with a particular health insurer company, how's that covered? What's the lawful basis for it? Who gets the data? How's it used? How long is it stored? All of that stuff. So what I'm describing is a forensic spreadsheet, an accounting, the way you account for money, but of how these companies use data. Now you look upon company A, which wants to acquire company B, as two spreadsheets. And when those spreadsheets combine and make a baby, what will that baby look like? And the answer is, if you do data forensics using this data protection principle of purpose limitation, so they have the document, or should, and you should be able to ask them for it, then you can see what they can do when they combine with their data. You're no longer thinking, well, they've X quantity of data. You now see what they're legally able to use the data for. And in Google's acquisition of Fitbit, for example, the remedy is all about online ads. I'm guessing when you look at those spreadsheets, though, you would be thinking, outside the current box, you'd be thinking about the insurance market, health insurance, for example. Is Google looking at getting in there? So there are tools that are left on the shelf of data protection. They are left there by the data protection authorities because they're not very active, unfortunately, yet, but I think that's changing. And they're left on the shelf, understandably, by competition enforcers. And it is time for both parties to work together with those tools.
And you mentioned elsewhere, Johnny, speaking
Hang on.
of this.
Is that the longest answer you've ever got in all of your interviews?
One of the longest, actually, yeah, but also one of the most eye-opening. And it's hard to disagree with these issues. But just to clarify things, because it looks that it's the task which even the biggest companies face if they have to enforce the current rules as they are designed to be enforced is actually insurmountable, because they have do so many synergies and so many linkages between different purposes of how and actually purposes are interdependent as well. And it's kind of hodgepodge or spaghetti code. So are they and we have some indications from the other side of Atlantic that it would be very difficult, but also this Bunder-Castellan case, that it will be very difficult to comply. Speaking of enforceability now from purely juristic side, do you think it's doable?
I mean, yes. Let's just take a look at what we don't have today. There are very simple things that today are not enforced. Do we have a granular disclosure of processing purposes from these companies? No, we do not. When you look at their terms on their websites, they still say things like, to improve your service, or we use your data to research new products. Now, they were told, I think back in 2018, if I remember, in guidance that the European data protection authorities all voted to adopt. They were told exactly those words weren't allowed. Where's the enforcement? So it looks like there's a big knot, a big complicated knot of incomprehensible threads that we cannot cut through. But actually, no one's turned up with a scissors at all. This set of tools is lying completely unused. So we're at the very, very first stages. And if you start thinking, you know, if you're the new DMA team in the European Commission and you're thinking, how are we going to enforce this? I mean, the first thing that will occur to you is, once you've designated your gatekeepers and you take a look at what they're doing, these companies were already infringing other areas of European law, you know, in broad daylight. And we're now supposed to come along and fix those problems that these fairly well-resourced enforcers haven't done. So yes, there is a very clear set of work to be done. It should be well understood. It just hasn't been done.
Let us now talk a little bit about how to do it. And we know that two areas of law, or two areas of regulation, data protection and GDPR in particular, and Digital Markets Act, are doomed to walk hand in hand, or it looks that they are so interdependent, at least as far as data privacy violation concern. And we learned from this newer generation of proactive regulation that one-stop shop, one single centralized enforcer appears to be a better solution, because there might be issues related to regulatory competition or some other particularities which slow down the enforcement if you designate too much or expect too much from national regulatory authorities. There is also a trend in the data protection. Could you which just emerged just very recently, and it's due to be implemented or at least discussed in more detail. Can you highlight this about this novelty?
Yeah, first, I do not endorse the idea that we should centralize data protection enforcement in Brussels. The problem of data protection enforcement is indeed a national one, but it's also a European level one. If the European Commission had been paying attention to the inaction at national level and had started to even talk about infringement procedures, we would not be where we are now. And that includes in competition. So, you know, there's a problem that we in Ireland had, a national disgrace, where for a long time our priesthood was protected, and it protected itself. It had a long record of sexual abuse of children in its care. And it turns out that what was happening was that when a priest was found to have been abusing children, instead of being prosecuted, put in jail, that priest was moved to another parish. Now, that is how we dealt with that problem for decades. It just spread the pain and the anguish. The data protection enforcement problem is alive and well in all or almost all member states, but it's also alive and well in Brussels. It's at all levels. And moving it just to Brussels will not fix that problem. Brussels can fix the problem. The Commissioner, Didier Reynders, can fix the problem. And he's now taking some steps after quite a lot of pressure to move in that direction. So the first part of the answer is, although the Irish Data Protection Commission and the Luxembourgish equivalent and others are not effective, although that is the case, we should not imagine that moving this to some new apparatus in Brussels will solve the problem. But let's talk in more positive terms about some solutions. About a year and a half ago, I continued some correspondence I'd been having with the European Commission, saying, you have a duty not only to intervene when European law is being infringed, you have a duty to know whether to intervene. And the Commission didn't take that line of argument properly, seriously. And I took that complaint to the European Ombudsman. The European Ombudsman ran an inquiry for about a year, which involved submissions from the Commission and from us several times. And from that, the European Commission has now made a commitment in January. And this is a momentous change. The Commission has now said that 6 times a year, it will obtain from every authority across Europe, all data protection authorities, fairly granular information about all large-scale cases. Now, a large-scale case involves people in more than one country or a really big tech player, for example. So all of the big companies you would imagine would be covered by large-scale cases. What the Commission will now obtain is the case number, when the thing began, and what other countries are involved, but really importantly, what date did this particular case enter a particular phase, and what date did it then move to the next phase on? Now, we have cases sitting on shelves gathering dust all over Europe. I have a complaint from late 2018 with the Irish authority. That's nowhere that I'm aware of. We're actually suing them in the Irish High Court over their failure to even start the key aspect of that case 4 years on. So this change from the European Commission means that the teacher is now inspecting the homework. And I think a few consequences will flow from that. One is all data protection authorities will now be terrified. They are independent, but they don't want to look bad. And they certainly don't want to look bad in front of the European Commission. And even though they are independent bodies, just like a court, the state is responsible for them. So the Commission does have recourse against the member state. We don't know if the Commission will be collecting these data retroactively. I hope that it will. If it does, it will immediately see a pattern of neglect probably all over Europe. There may be a few bright, shining examples of good practice. I hope there will be, but we'll see problems all over the place. Certainly in Ireland, we'll see those problems. And it will be very hard for the Commission to not start talking about infringement procedures. Now, I have the Commissioner's correspondence with the Irish Minister for Justice and with the Irish Data Protection Commissioner under Freedom of Information. And he did actually hint at infringement procedures almost a year ago. So, you know, we're moving into a new moment with data protection law. We have had half a decade where Europe talked a good game and did nothing of consequence. But now we're actually at a point where we might see action. The other big change is that in July, probably, the Commission will introduce a new regulation that supplements the GDPR. It is not reopening the GDPR for negotiation, but this supplemental regulation will introduce harmonizing procedures to enhance, that's its own language, to fix is my language, how different member states work together on these cases. And it will probably have, there's a list of things to be fixed that was agreed by the European Data Protection Board in Vienna, I think last April, the Vienna Declaration. So the list is things like the rights of the complainant, the right of the complainant to access the file, deadlines for procedures, that kind of stuff. Just simple ways of making the system work better. So we've had a false start where Europe told the world, behold, we really are a regulatory superpower. With the winds of Snowden at its back, it defied the greatest lobbying attempt up to that point so far in Europe. It's now been surpassed, of course. And it introduced pretty strong rules. Now, the mechanisms for how they're applied were a bit maybe immature, but it introduced pretty strong rules. Up until now, the burden of fear about those rules has fallen on very small operators. The big players are happy. The hammer hasn't fallen on them. And yet you've got very, very small operators running in fear because of GDPR. So GDPR has become this term of frustration and red tape. It should have been the thing that freed people, that protected them, protected their data, but also I think it should have had a profound market fixing consequence, secondary consequence. I'm hoping we see those things in the next decade, next half decade.
Okay, that makes things much more optimistic. Even for those who, for the sake of convenience, maybe even consider themselves as kind of healthy skeptics, thinking that big tech knows 1,001 way how to comply with the letter of law while circumventing the essence, etc.
Yeah,
it looks that the current commission has its kind of better understanding, and it's much more proactive. It proves it with cases, with new proposals and the enforcement, and the gap is getting shorter. It will never be short enough. It's still for obvious reasons. Let me ask you, Johnny, another question. You coming back to online advertising model, where greater data protection rule will make it more difficult for the kind of outsider villains to become the mainstream data controllers or brokers or handlers or matchers. We also have another huge industry which was the pioneering and trend-setting industry in online in advertising the past, and which still remains quite important, even if it's somehow dispersed and separated across smaller players. It's not integrated. Media.
Yeah.
Do you think it's feasible to imagine a model where media, by controlling and knowing so much for so long, put forward something which would be alternative to RTB, or something which ameliorate it a little bit? What is the relationship between online and traditional advertising models?
That's a good question. I used to work for a publisher for the Irish Times, and on these issues, one of the smartest voices you'll hear is Jason Kint, who heads an international media trade body called Digital Content Next. And I'm very sympathetic to Worthy Media's mission. The problem is, and I remember this from working at a publisher, everything in the history of digital, it's a brief history, but everything from the 90s on, late 90s on, was bad news for the newspapers and other media. Bad news after bad news after bad news after bad news. And they lost, I think in many cases, they lost confidence, understandably. And when Google and others came calling, and before Google, there were many, many other companies too. And when these companies came calling, it's the same for advertisers, by the way. Publishers were hoodwinked. They were fooled. They were conned. In some cases, I think that tech companies con themselves too, but the outcome was better for them. Think about advertisers for a moment. There's that old phrase from John Wanamaker. It's long in use for about a century. He says, I know 50% of my ad budget works. The darndest thing is I don't know which 50%. What that quote reminds us of is that advertising is an art, not a science. Now, it became a little bit scientific in the 50s and 60s with polling and Gallup and all of that. You know, there was a new science to it in the middle of the last century, but it was still an art, and largely a creative art. Then, late 90s, early 2000s, people turned up at spreadsheets, and they said, no, it's a science. We can link everything. And if you, like me, studied humanities, you have acute physics envy, and you are not well placed in an argument if someone confronts you with a chart. There's a certain majesty to a chart that defeats the classicist or the person who studied English or law, etc., or history. But the charts didn't mean anything, it turns out. We know that they didn't mean anything now because of the level of fraud in online advertising. We don't know how many people look at an ad. We, by the way, genuinely, we do not know how many people look at an ad unless the person looks at an ad, clicks on it, goes to the place where they can buy the product, puts in a credit card number, buys the product, and does not return it. Then they're a human, for certain. But everything up to that point, probably a bot. And it might be a bot with a very complicated life, and you're tracking that bot to within an inch of its life, and it's bringing in cash all the time by trailing ad spend, by attracting ad spend to itself, and then visiting properties where it is being asked to visit to bring the advertiser spend to those properties. It's a huge fraud. The estimates range from single to double-digit billions, soon triple-digit billions. But genuinely, we don't know the level of fraud. We just know it seems to be very, very large. So we've been duped by the supposed science. And I think people who are thinking about online advertising with any degree of seriousness are at least open to recognizing that they actually don't know if their ads are being seen by a human or not. Now, for publishers, there's a power check here. This is a moment to check how much power they have. In the print world, publishers had an awful lot of power. And if you wanted to try to compete with a publisher, a big publisher, you know, it wasn't really an easy market for you. So publishers were the big players. In the online world, publishers are largely commodified. And they're not just commodified. By the way, I mean from the perspective of advertisers. They're not only commodified in many cases, they are arbitraged. So let's imagine you are a very high-end publication. Let's imagine you're The Guardian, or the Wall Street Journal or something. A advertiser or an ad agency on behalf of an advertiser buys space on your property, ad space, for example, or is simply present, receiving bid requests through RTB without spending money on your property, perhaps, for a period of time, starts to see the kind of people, maybe the exact people who visit your property, and then buys those people for cents on the dollar when those people visit conspiracytheory.com. So you've spent a lot of money on your content, Oles, as you in a sense do, actually. You spend a lot of time on your content. And what if you were advertising, selling ads on your content, and then I could find the same viewer of these wonderful videos you shoot with others? I could find the same viewer for cents on the dollar on a porn site somewhere when that viewer goes to the porn site, or to the "you won't believe what this celebrity looks like now" site. So there's arbitrage. And on top of the arbitrage and the fraud, there are hidden fees. The publishers don't know what the fees are. The advertisers don't know what the fees are. And when their trade bodies try to find out, as the British one did in association with PwC, they do not get very far, despite spending a year and a half at it. Now, let me give you an example of fees that we know about. The Guardian took a case against a big AdTech player called Rubicon in 2017, I think. And as part of that case, the Guardian ran a sting operation to gather evidence. It set up a fake advertiser. So the Guardian's purporting to be an advertiser. It bought ads with its own money on its own online website, theguardian.com. And for every pound sterling that they spent buying rectangles on theguardian.com as the fake advertiser, they as publisher received only 30p. And 70% went off on all the bells and whistles and complexity of the AdTech system. Now, the estimates for what those fees are range from 70% to 45%, depending who you listen to. The UK Competition and Markets Authority might have landed at 45 or 55, I can't remember. They had a third party try and assess it. Which is no one knows. No one knows what the hidden fees are because they're hidden. And they can't find out, and the estimates are all over the place. So today's system is a total mess. So when the GDPR came, and it was clear people were going to need to be asked, not with the consent spam we have today, but that publishers were going to be able to use trust that their repeat viewers and visitors might have in them, that they could play a trust game that often they haven't really played. And I surveyed publishers and I said, do you think this will be an advantage to you? And they said, yes, it will. And then you know what they did? They let the IAB come up with its consent system where you could visit one publisher and get, not consent, completely unlawful consent. We're litigating against it now across the web for all of these companies. So the publishers are constantly playing a game of how can we not have power? And the way publishers get power, this is my answer to every problem, by the way, is data protection. Publishers could completely strip the intermediaries of power, and they could strip big tech of power by getting behind the data protection mission. There's a study that was commissioned by the European Commission, and it was published, I think, a month ago. It was written by an outfit called AWO. And what AWO, one of the things they proposed is the companies in the middle, these tech firms in online advertising, it might be useful to legislate to prohibit them from being data controllers of publisher data. So when you visit a publisher, The Economist, and The Economist says, do you trust us and Audi to give you some recommendation? And you say, yes, Economist and Audi, I do. The dumb plumbing in between, all of those tech companies that are supposed to just do distribution, they would not be allowed to use that data for any other processing purpose. They would just use the data at the behest of the publisher, the thing that you agreed to.
So basically, there is no need to allow the media to create an alternative machinery where they would somehow replicate the best and maybe optimize a little bit and create competition to the current model.
That's not a question for me. Go ahead and innovate, come up with something better. Yes, there's a great example. There's a company called Opt-Out. It's a terrible name, but it's a good company. They were the in-house team for the Dutch publishing network, NPO. Actually, they were the in-house team for the sales company, a sales house called Ster, S-T-E-R, which serviced NPO. And NPO is part publicly financed. Now it's fully publicly financed, but there was a year where it removed all tracking stuff, I think, from their commercial activity on their own properties. Forget about YouTube ads, anything else. On their own properties, they removed all third-party tracking stuff. And we've got the revenue per month, and you can compare it to the previous year. The revenue didn't go down, right? And actually, at the end of the year, it went up. There may be other reasons why it went up, but we're seeing very positive examples of where publishers are doing interesting things.
Another question, Johnny, before we close our conversation, I imagine you must already approaching an hour. Counterfactual. When we talk about third-party cooking and cookies and real-time bidding, it looks that you describe it as a pathology, as a kind of deviation from an ordinary development, or at least as something which Detroit, dirty cars with no safety control, etc., which requires an immediate kind of regulation and somehow putting it under control and bringing it to more kind of civilized fashion. It looks, however, as a trend, as a technological development. If leaving aside Brussels effect, which is pervasive, it's not impossible to imagine a scenario where these techniques will be enforced in other jurisdictions which are less, more advantageous and more, risky and care less about privacy and just more welcoming. Would it happen, coming back to AI, that the system would train its muscles at the chain where the link is the weakest, so to say, and then somehow have this advantage over the more ethically mindful technology? I know it's an old question, but I'm interested in hearing your kind of more philosophical answer, if not empirical, essentially.
Okay. There's a few things to pick up. First, the Brussels effect. Let's just pick up on that before we get onto AI and whether more data is better and China's better off and so on. Is the Brussels effect real? It was real. We were briefly a regulatory superpower. In the case of data protection law, if you look at the jurisdictions around the world and quantify them by GDP, you'll see that well over half of the globe either enacted or was ready to enact, drafted GDPR clones. And that includes China's new information security standard from a few years ago. So it did have a Brussels effect, yes. But if you look today, the GDPR has not been what it ought to have been because it has not been applied. Now, I'm hoping it will be applied, and we've talked about that, and I am optimistic. But let's just weigh some of the pain of our failure to stand up and discharge our responsibilities. Europe led the way. Countries all over the world started to emulate that law. And India's data protection bill, was even better than the GDPR. It took the GDPR and it went a little bit further, tougher standards in some areas, or a broader way of thinking. Well, in the last few months, India has dumped that draft in the bin, and it has replaced it with a really nasty, limiting data law. this is, I think, what happens when you tell the world you're a regulatory superpower and then you don't actually apply the law that you have been promoting globally as the global standard. And what that means is not just that the broader agenda of enhancing fundamental freedoms globally is betrayed. It also has a commercial downside because Europe is not able to set the rules of the road globally for digital trade. So this was a huge own goal, and Europe is now, I hope, I don't think it understands the need to, I don't think the Commission does, but I hope it learns that it needs to play a game of catch up. Now, on this question about whether a respect for rights is at odds with innovation, which is roughly how I interpret what you were really saying, we do an awful lot of work at ICCL on the EU AI Act. And you would be amazed at the kind of minor technical details in the original proposal that now, luckily, I think will be fixed. But for example, the definition of AI, which comes from the OECD definition, that needs to be tweaked because it isn't all, it doesn't encompass what AI actually is. Even things like the Act regulates individual AI software, but not the interplay of multiple AI softwares. It's like it's regulating a device, not a network. You know, there's some very basic fixes that we need to get involved with and try and help. And my colleague, Chris Srishank, is leading on that. Now, one of the things that Chris would say if he were here, and he's a computer science PhD, so he has some sense of what he's speaking about, is it is a fallacy to claim that more data equals a better model. There are some niches of machine learning where that is true, but there are many broader areas where actually it's contrary to the fact. Let me give you a funny example. We have been debating whether we should invest in AI ourselves. But so we're a advocacy, litigation, let's say applied activism group. We're a small unit with a very hopefully big impact. And we need to be able to parse technical documentation, understand what the standards bodies are doing. If we're going to be meeting a commissioner or an official or a minister, we need to know all about their speeches. So we need to get through a lot of text quickly. And the first thing that we would not be doing if we were building such a system is feeding it an awful lot of information. Because from that, inevitably, at least with the GPT systems that people are currently thinking about, you end up with completely incorrect assumptions and reactions to prompts. So certainly in our own case, narrow is better, but even as a general principle, it has been a mistake to assume that more data is the answer. And when I was working at Brave, I found myself having to tell US lawmakers, look, the Europeans have an answer here that allows nascent competitors based in San Francisco, like us at Brave when I worked for them, to get out from under the cover of these big tech firms and compete and introduce something new. It's counterintuitive to say, but the rules work for good product. I thought that when I worked in industry. Yes, they work for rights. Yes, they're essential to protect society and democracy in the future. But also, let's not just take, and I know you're not doing it, but some lawmakers do, let's not just take industry's current line as though it's gospel. Because very often the lobbyist who is speaking to the lawmaker has no clue how the technology works. No clue at all. And their own technologist might be appalled if they read what they were saying to the lawmaker. So, one of the things we find ourselves having impact on is when we can say, to a legislator, here's how this thing actually works. You know, we've spoken with a bunch of engineers, we understand what they're saying, here's the source material, it does not do what it is claimed to do. And that's a reoccurring thing. You even get it for debates over whether the police should be equipped with drones and so on in all of our areas of work.
Or facial recognition technology stuff as well.
Bingo.
Johnny, it was a really fascinating conversation. We have a tradition asking our guests to recommend some, you know, algorithm of not success, but algorithm of being useful and enjoying what you do in research stuff for students, for those who are, you know, who facing this kind of cacophony of different opportunities, ideas, avenues, how to develop where to focus their limited time and interest. I know it's hard to offer such, you know, all-inclusive universal recommendation, but if you just sit and suggest one or two things which would be appealing, that would be great.
I was trained as an archival historian, and an archival historian is someone who goes into the archives and reads the original papers. So what was this minister or head of state thinking on such and such a day? You read their notes, you see the text, and you get very used to using footnotes and referring to sources. I have found it to be incredibly useful to go to the source material, to avoid commentaries, avoid reading analysis until you have read the source material first. Now, you might say, I do not have time for that. Well, you could spend an awful lot of time listening to supposition, which is probably several accumulated layers of inference over the substance. And you could listen to lots of that about lots of things. Or you could form your view based on the source, on a smaller number of things. And that is nearly always much, much more valuable. And you know where you stand. A second thing I'd suggest, I worked for a while as a designer, and you cannot understand something, it seems to me, until you've had to explain it. And, you know, explanation means many different things. But until you've had to actually diagram the thing. I remember working in a company called Pagefair with really good engineers. And these were the kind of engineers who would have beautiful language as well. They were polymaths. And they would go to the whiteboard and they'd explain how something really complicated worked. And by the time they'd finished explaining it, you'd see the mastery of it because they'd managed to summarize and encapsulate it without missing out on the detail. So going to the sources is it's one way to feel confident in your view, and then figuring out how to explain it. And you can master an area, and having a few areas that you feel some mastery over, some confidence with, you can add on to those areas rapidly. And unlike most colleagues, you then won't be talking in gibberish, layers of inference where you've read some commentary that you got for free on the internet somewhere.
Jenny Ryan, thank you very much for presenting your really impactful and impressive and convincing views to us. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Good to speak with you.